Let me tell you about the baby shower that changed everything. It was supposed to be a day of celebration, but instead, it became a battle for control. My mother-in-law, Linda, stood up in front of everyone, smirked, and said, "We've chosen the baby's name, since we're the real parents here." And just when I thought it couldn't get worse, my husband, Mark, laughed. But then, he did something I never expected. The look on Linda's face was priceless. The room was decorated with pastel pink and blue streamers, soft ribbons tied around the backs of chairs, and a long table stacked with carefully wrapped gifts, all covered in cutesy baby-themed wrapping paper. Laughter and light conversation filled the space, but beneath the surface, something felt off. I could feel it in the way people glanced at me, the subtle tension in the air, the way my mother-in-law, Linda, held herself with a smugness I had come to recognize as a warning. It wasn't unusual for her to act like she was the one in charge of my life, but today, something was different, and my gut told me I wasn't going to like it. I forced a smile as I accepted yet another well-meaning congratulations from a distant relative of Mark's, my husband. My belly was round and heavy, the baby shifting inside me, a constant reminder of why I had agreed to this ridiculous, over-the-top shower in the first place. I had wanted something small, intimate, something that felt like it was about me and my baby. Instead, Linda had hijacked it, turning it into a grand production filled with her guests, her ideas, and, apparently, her announcements. I noticed Mark standing near the drink table, chatting with his cousin, but his eyes flickered toward me like he knew exactly what I was feeling. He knew I hated this. He knew I was barely tolerating it. But what I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was just how far his mother was about to push me today. Linda clinked her glass loudly, the shrill sound cutting through the chatter like a knife. The room fell silent almost instantly, all eyes shifting toward her. I felt my stomach tighten, not from the baby, but from something else entirely, an unshakable dread. "Well, since we're all here to celebrate this beautiful blessing," she began, her voice dripping with that fake warmth she used whenever she wanted to pretend she cared, "I thought now would be the perfect time to share something special with all of you." She beamed as if this were her moment, as if she were the one carrying this child, as if she were the star of the show. My fingers tightened around the armrest of my chair. "We've chosen the baby's name," she continued, her eyes flicking to me just briefly, just long enough for me to see the gloating triumph in them, "since we're the real parents here." The words rang in my ears, bouncing around my skull, knocking the air right out of my
Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
lungs. A murmur spread through the room as guests exchanged confused glances, some chuckling awkwardly, others stiffening in discomfort. I blinked, trying to process what she had just said, trying to convince myself that I must have misheard, that no one, would have the audacity to make such an outrageous, insulting, downright deranged claim at someone else's baby shower. And then I saw the smirk on her face, that little upward twitch of her lips, and I knew. Oh, she meant it. She meant every single word. Before I could even form a response, before the shock could morph into the burning rage bubbling just beneath my skin, Mark suddenly laughed. Not just a chuckle, not just an awkward laugh to diffuse the tension, he laughed. Loud and clear, right in the middle of the stunned silence. For one brief, excruciating second, I thought he was agreeing with her. My heart clenched painfully in my chest, and I could feel my nails digging into my palms. But then I looked at him. His laughter wasn't warm. It wasn't amused. It was sharp, edged with something dangerous. He shook his head, a grin still lingering on his face, but his eyes had darkened, his posture shifting just slightly as he turned toward his mother. "Oh, really?" he said, his voice smooth but carrying an unmistakable weight. "Then you won't mind this announcement." The entire room seemed to hold its breath, the tension so thick it was suffocating. Linda's smirk faltered for just a moment, just long enough for me to catch it before she plastered it back in place. She was trying to act unfazed, but I knew she wasn't expecting this. Mark reached into his jacket pocket, his fingers curling around something as he took a step forward, placing himself directly between his mother and me. I had no idea what he was about to do. But whatever it was, the look on Linda's face was about to be priceless. I should have seen it coming long before the baby shower, long before Linda stood there with that smug expression plastered across her face, long before she had the audacity to declare herself the real parent of my child. Looking back, the signs were everywhere, creeping into every corner of my life, slowly eroding my sense of control until it felt like I was nothing more than a vessel, an inconvenience standing in the way of her grand vision. She had been testing her limits from the very moment she found out I was pregnant, pushing further and further, seeing exactly how much she could take from me before I finally snapped. It started with the subtle things, the little remarks that might have seemed harmless to anyone who wasn't paying attention. She'd tilt her head, frown slightly, and say something like, "Are you sure you should be eating that?" Whenever I reached for a piece of chocolate or, God forbid, a second helping of dinner. She'd glance at my stomach, shake her head, and sigh before launching into some long-winded story about how she had stayed so fit and healthy during pregnancy, how her son had been born so strong because she had done everything the right way. At first, I ignored it. I told myself she was just old-fashioned, that she was trying to be helpful in her own infuriating way, that she wasn't intentionally undermining me at every turn. But then came the bigger things, the doctor's appointments she somehow always found out about and insisted on attending, the prenatal classes she signed me up for without asking, the nursery designs she presented to me as if my own ideas were completely irrelevant. Every single time I made a decision, she had a better one. Every single time I set a boundary, she found a way to squeeze past it. And the worst part? Mark barely did anything to stop it. Oh, he would say the right things when we were alone, telling me to just ignore her, telling me she was overbearing but harmless, telling me that she would calm down once the baby arrived. But when she was in the room, when she was pushing her agenda right in front of him, he would just chuckle, shake his head, and brush it off like it was nothing more than a quirk, a harmless personality trait. Something I should just learn to tolerate because that's just how she is. I wanted to believe he was on my side. I wanted to believe that he wasn't enjoying this, that he wasn't secretly relieved to have his mother making all the hard choices so that he didn't have to. But sometimes, when I caught him watching her with that unreadable expression, when I saw the way his lips pressed together like he was holding something back, I wondered if he was playing both sides. And then, I found the document. It wasn't even hidden, not really. I had been searching through the kitchen drawers, looking for the spare set of house keys, when I found it tucked between a stack of old mail and a half-empty notepad covered in Linda's obsessive lists. It was a crisp, freshly printed sheet of paper, her elegant, looping handwriting scrawled across the margins, little notes in red ink marking certain sections like she had been studying it, memorizing it, preparing for something I hadn't yet begun to comprehend. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. The words blurred together in my mind, the legal jargon twisting into something unreal, impossible, incomprehensible. And then, as my eyes darted across the page, one sentence grabbed me by the throat and refused to let go. In the event that the biological mother is deemed unfit or incapable of providing a stable environment, guardianship shall be transferred to the petitioning family member, hereby recognized as the rightful caregiver and parental authority. I read it again. And again. My hands were shaking so hard that the paper crinkled between my fingers, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps as the full weight of it settled into my chest. Linda hadn't just thought about taking my baby. She had been planning for it. The paper in my hands felt heavier than it should have, its weight pressing into my fingers as if the ink itself carried the full force of Linda's delusions. My eyes traced over the words again, desperately searching for some sign that I was misunderstanding what I was reading, that there was some logical explanation beyond the nightmare my mind was already constructing. But no matter how many times I read it, the meaning remained the same. Linda had tried to file for legal guardianship over my unborn child. A cold wave of nausea crashed over me as my thoughts scrambled for clarity, my breathing shallow as I tried to steady my racing heart. She hadn't just been meddling or overstepping like she always did. This wasn't another one of her self-important decisions about nursery colors or baby names. This was calculated. This was serious. She had drafted legal documents, consulted with someone, planned an entire strategy to have my baby legally removed from my custody. And the wording, that carefully crafted, insidious language about being deemed unfit or incapable, it sent a chill down my spine. What had she been telling people? Had she already begun planting seeds, whispering her poisonous lies to friends, to family, to anyone who would listen? Was she already laying the foundation for an argument that I was too unstable, too irresponsible, too unprepared to be a mother? Had she been watching me, documenting my every move, waiting for me to make a single mistake she could use against me? I stormed out of the kitchen, my fists clenched so tightly that my nails dug into my palms, my breath uneven as I moved through the house with only one thought in my mind. I needed to find Mark. If he had known about this, if he had been complicit in this insanity, if he had let his mother scheme behind my back without telling me, I didn't know how I would ever forgive him. I found him in the living room, his feet propped up on the coffee table, scrolling absently through his phone like nothing in the world was wrong, like everything was perfectly normal. But the second he looked up and saw my face, his expression changed, his body tensed, his phone slipping from his hand and landing with a soft thud against the cushions beside him. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I threw the paper onto his lap, crossing my arms as I glared down at him, waiting for the moment realization would hit. I wanted to see the exact second he understood just how deep this had gone, how far his mother had taken it, how much damage she had been willing to cause just to maintain her grip over him, over me, over this baby that wasn't hers to control. Mark picked up the document, his eyes scanning the text, his brow furrowing as he absorbed every word. And then, instead of shock or confusion or the immediate anger I had been expecting, his lips pressed into a thin line, his fingers tightening around the edges of the paper. He didn't look surprised. I felt something crack inside me, something raw and ugly and furious. "You knew," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, my chest tightening as I forced the words out. "You knew she was doing this." Mark exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face, before finally meeting my gaze with something I couldn't quite place. Guilt, frustration, maybe even exhaustion. But not fear. Not panic. Not the kind of reaction a man would have if he had just uncovered a horrific betrayal. "I didn't just know," he admitted, his voice steady but low, as if he had been rehearsing this conversation in his head for weeks. "I've been stringing her along, letting her think she's in control, gathering evidence to prove exactly what she's been doing. I needed her to show her hand, and now she finally has." I blinked, my mind struggling to shift gears as my anger tripped over itself, caught somewhere between outrage and disbelief. He had been playing her? He had been leading her on, letting her believe she was winning, all while collecting proof against her? Mark leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his fingers laced together as he studied me carefully. I knew if I warned her off, she'd just be more careful. But if I let her think she was getting away with it, if I let her think I was on her side, she'd get sloppy. And she did. For a moment, I just stood there, my heartbeat pounding in my ears, my fingers twitching at my sides as the weight of his words settled over me. He had played his own mother. He had led her to believe she was winning, had allowed her to orchestrate her little scheme, all while waiting for the perfect moment to turn the tables. And she still had no idea. I didn't know whether to be relieved or furious. "She still thinks you're on her side," I said finally, watching the way Mark's jaw tightened, the way his gaze darkened just slightly. "Yeah," he admitted, his voice flat. "And as long as she does, she'll keep digging herself deeper." It wasn't the reassurance I had been hoping for, but it was something. It was a weapon. It was a chance. Linda had no idea the trap had already been set. And she had no idea just how much she was about to lose. I let out a slow breath, my lips curving into something that wasn't quite a smile, but wasn't entirely devoid of satisfaction either. "Good," I murmured, meeting his gaze with something colder, something sharper, something that carried the weight of everything she had done to me. Because we're going to make her regret this. The plan came together faster than I had expected, the pieces falling into place with an almost unnerving ease, as if the universe itself had been waiting for us to finally strike back. Mark and I spent the next few days working in secret, whispering in hushed voices behind closed doors, exchanging knowing glances whenever Linda would waltz into the room, completely unaware that she was walking straight into the trap we had set for her. Linda had always been the type to believe she was the smartest person in any room, the kind of woman who thrived on control, who lived for the feeling of bending people to her will, who thought she could manipulate anyone into doing exactly what she wanted. And that arrogance, that overconfidence, was exactly what we were going to use against her. She had spent months treating me like an afterthought, making plans for my child as if I didn't exist, speaking in grand declarations about what she would do once the baby was here, never once stopping to consider that maybe, just maybe, I was no longer willing to play her little game. So, we gave her what she wanted. Or at least, we let her think we did. It wasn't hard to make it look official, not with the right wording and a carefully placed signature, a document drafted to look as if it held legal weight when, in reality, it was nothing more than an elaborate illusion. It was a simple piece of paper, a mock agreement stating that, in the event of my inability to care for my child, full custody and guardianship would be transferred to Linda, making her the sole decision-maker in my baby's life. There were just enough legal-sounding terms to make it believable, just enough structure to make it seem like she had finally won. And the second we placed it in front of her, her reaction was exactly what we had expected. We chose the moment carefully, waiting until we were surrounded by family, making sure there were plenty of witnesses, people she would want to impress, people she would never want to see her lose. She took the bait without hesitation, her fingers gripping the pen so tightly that her knuckles turned white, her smirk practically dripping with victory as she scrawled her name across the page with a flourish, barely even stopping to read through the details before sealing her fate. I watched her as she did it, watched the way her chest swelled with pride, watched the way she shot me a condescending glance, as if she were daring me to challenge her, as if she thought this was the moment she had finally beaten me. Her voice was thick with self-satisfaction as she straightened her shoulders and addressed the room, making some grand speech about how a mother always knows best, how she had been willing to step up and make the hard choices for the sake of her grandchild, how she had done what was necessary to ensure the right future for this baby, because she simply couldn't stand by and watch her precious grandson be raised by someone who clearly wasn't capable. I held my tongue, biting down hard enough to nearly draw blood, keeping my expression neutral even as every single word she spoke made my skin crawl. I wanted to scream at her, wanted to rip the paper out of her hands, wanted to throw every single disgusting thing she had ever done back in her face, but I didn't. Instead, I just smiled, tilting my head slightly as I exchanged a glance with Mark, who was already reaching for the real document. The actual document. The one that was legally binding. The one that would strip her of the very control she had been desperately clinging to. Mark stepped forward, his expression unreadable as he calmly placed the second document in front of her, setting it down carefully on the table before sliding it across the surface, his voice eerily steady as he spoke the words that would shatter her entire world. "Now that we've got that out of the way," he said, his tone light but firm, "I think it's only fair that we make things official." Linda barely spared him a glance at first, too caught up in the high of her own imagined victory, still basking in the glow of what she thought she had just accomplished. But as her eyes flicked down to the paper in front of her, as she began scanning the neatly typed words, as her smug expression froze and then slowly crumbled, I saw the exact moment it hit her. She read it once, then twice, then a third time, her fingers trembling slightly as they hovered over the page, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts as the reality of what she was holding finally sank in. A restraining order. Legally signed. Officially filed. Ironclad. She wasn't gaining control, she was losing it completely. Mark's voice was calm but firm, unwavering as he delivered the final blow. Effective immediately, you are legally prohibited from making any decisions regarding our child. You are not allowed to interfere, not allowed to contact us without permission, and if you attempt to go against these terms, we will have grounds to take further action. Linda's face drained of color, her lips parting as if she were about to argue, but for once, she was completely speechless. The entire room was silent, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone, a tension so thick it felt suffocating. I could see the wheels turning in her head, the frantic scrambling of someone who had just realized they had lost everything. And then, all at once, the dam finally broke. "You can't do this to me!" She shrieked, her voice cracking with raw disbelief, her entire body shaking as she clutched the useless custody document to her chest like it could somehow undo what had just happened. "You have no right. I was only doing what's best for the baby. You think you can just erase me from his life?" I met her gaze, my own expression steady, my voice low but deadly sharp. "No," I said, my words slicing through the air like a blade. "You did that all by yourself." Linda stood frozen in place, her hands shaking as she clutched the useless document, her wide eyes darting between Mark and me as if she couldn't comprehend what had just happened. Her chest rose and fell in uneven breaths, her mouth opening and closing as she searched for the right words, some way to turn the situation back in her favor, some last-ditch effort to regain the control she had just lost. But for the first time since I had known her, she had nothing, not a single manipulative phrase, not a single excuse that could undo the damage she had done, not a single person willing to stand at her side. The silence in the room stretched, thick and suffocating, the weight of what had just unfolded pressing down on everyone who had just witnessed her greatest humiliation. Then, as if the realization hit her all at once, Linda's expression twisted, her body tensing as she took a sharp step forward, her voice rising with the kind of desperation that only came from someone who knew they had already lost. "You think this is over?" She spat, her eyes locking onto Mark with something vicious, something nearly unhinged. "You really think a piece of paper can keep me away from my own grandson? Do you have any idea who I know, what I can do, how easily I can make this disappear? You have no idea the kind of fight you're about to start." She turned toward the rest of the family then, her gaze sweeping across the room, searching for an ally, for someone, anyone, who would back her up, who would shake their head and tell her that this was all a mistake, that this was going too far, that she was still the respected matriarch she believed herself to be. But the longer the silence stretched, the more her face crumbled, the more her confidence wavered, the more she realized that no one, not a single person, was on her side anymore. Then Mark sighed, shaking his head, his fingers tightening around the phone he had been holding at his side. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, but there was something cold beneath it, something unshakable. "You still don't get it, do you?" he murmured, his gaze steady, his posture unmovable. "This isn't just about what you did today. This isn't just about the documents, the legal games, or the disgusting way you've tried to take over Sarah's life. This is about everything. Everything you've said, everything you've done, every single time you've tried to manipulate your way into stealing this child from the woman who is actually carrying him." Linda's lips parted, but before she could speak, before she could try to turn it around, Mark lifted his phone and pressed a single button. And then, her voice filled the room. It started as a murmur, distorted at first, but then, clear as day, Linda's unmistakable tone rang out, sharp, calculated, and dripping with the arrogance of someone who had never considered the possibility of being caught. "I don't care what Sarah wants. The moment that baby is born, she won't have a choice anymore. If I have to go to court, if I have to call in favors, if I have to make sure she looks like an unfit mother, I'll do it. Mark will come around eventually. He always does." Gasps rippled through the room, shocked whispers filling the air as the rest of the family absorbed what they had just heard, their faces morphing from disbelief to anger to something dangerously close to disgust. Linda's face had gone pale, her hands trembling, her mouth hanging open as she turned to Mark, shaking her head furiously, her breath coming in frantic gasps. No, you set me up. She choked out, her voice barely above a whisper, a stark contrast to the fury she had displayed only moments before. You recorded me? You tricked me? Mark tilted his head slightly, his expression eerily calm, his shoulders relaxed in a way that made it abundantly clear that he had won. I let you talk, he said simply, his lips curving just slightly in something that was not quite a smile. And you gave me exactly what I needed. Linda turned to the rest of the family again, desperation bleeding into every inch of her expression, her hands twitching as she gestured wildly, as if trying to grasp onto the power that had just been ripped from her hands. You know me, she exclaimed, her voice cracking. You all know me. I would never, I was just saying things, I didn't mean them. It was just talk. But her husband, John, had been silent the entire time, his arms crossed, his lips pressed together, his gaze locked onto her with something unreadable, something deep and unfamiliar, something dangerous. And then, finally, he spoke. Is that how it was when you did this to me? He asked, his voice deceptively soft, but carrying enough weight that the entire room fell silent again. Just talk? Just manipulation? Just another little scheme to get exactly what you wanted? Linda's breath hitched, her entire body locking up as if someone had just doused her in ice water, her eyes darting to him in panic. John, she whispered, barely able to get the word out. He shook his head, his expression dark, his voice like steel. I stayed quiet for a long time, he said, taking a slow step forward, his presence looming over her now, the years of secrets and silence and quiet resentment thick in the air. I let you spin your stories, I let you rewrite history, I let you control everything because it was easier than fighting you. But now, I have to wonder, was I just another pawn to you? Just another person you used to get what you wanted? Linda took a staggering step backward, but she had nowhere to go, the walls closing in, the weight of her own lies crushing her from every angle. I stepped forward then, my voice soft, but razor-sharp. Looks like you finally ran out of people to control, I whispered, leaning in just slightly, watching as the last remnants of her smug confidence drained from her face. Now, let me tell you my baby's real name. Linda's breath came in sharp, uneven gasps as she stood there, her shoulders trembling, her entire body teetering between rage and despair, the last remnants of her carefully crafted control slipping through her fingers like sand. The room was still thick with the weight of everything that had just unfolded, the truth of her manipulation now exposed for everyone to see, leaving her completely stripped of the power she had once wielded so effortlessly. But even now, even as her own husband looked at her with quiet disgust, even as her family refused to meet her desperate gaze, even as the walls of her perfectly curated life crumbled around her, she still had one last demand. One last desperate attempt to hold on to something, anything, that would make her believe she wasn't completely powerless. Tell me the baby's name, she hissed, her voice breaking in the middle, her hands clenched so tightly at her sides that I could see the veins rising beneath her skin. You owe me that much, you ungrateful little girl. After everything I have done for you, after everything I have sacrificed, after everything I have tried to build for this family, you can't take this from me. You can't just shut me out like I'm nothing. I deserve to know his name. I could feel the tension radiating from Mark beside me, his jaw tight, his hands balled into fists, his entire body coiled with barely restrained anger. I knew he wanted to tear into her, to tell her that she had lost every right to demand anything from us, to make her feel even a fraction of the pain she had put us through. But this moment wasn't his to take, it was mine. So I took a slow, deliberate step forward, letting the silence stretch just long enough for her to squirm, letting the anticipation eat away at her pride, watching as her breath hitched in her throat. I wanted her to feel this moment, to feel the weight of what was coming, to know, truly know, that she had lost everything. You want to know his name? I asked, tilting my head slightly, keeping my voice calm, steady, but sharp enough to cut through the air like a blade. You want to hear the name of the child you thought you could take from me? The child you tried to steal, manipulate, and control before he was even born? Fine, Linda. I'll tell you his name. Her lips parted, her breath coming in shallow, expectant gasps, her entire body rigid as she waited, as if somehow, in some deluded part of her mind, she still believed she could claim ownership over this child with nothing more than a name. I inhaled slowly, letting the moment settle, then I spoke. "His name," I said, my voice dropping just slightly, "is Daniel." The second the name left my lips, it was like the entire room shifted. Linda's reaction was instant, violent, catastrophic. Her face drained of color so quickly that, for a brief second, I thought she might collapse right then and there, her knees buckling beneath her, her breath stuttering out of her lungs in a way that sounded almost inhuman. Her hands trembled as they flew to her mouth, as if trying to physically push back the sound of her own shock, as if trying to contain the memory that had just been ripped from whatever dark place she had buried it in. Her eyes locked onto mine, wide and wild, filled with something I had never seen before, something far beyond anger, something deeper than just pain. It was fear. Real, genuine fear. "Why you?" she choked out, her voice cracking into something raw and broken, her head shaking violently, refusing to believe what she had just heard. "No. No, you wouldn't. You couldn't have. Not him. Not that name. Not," but I didn't back down. I didn't let her escape. "Yes, Linda," I said, taking another step forward, watching as she shrank back, as her entire body seemed to fold in on itself, as if she were suddenly small for the first time in her life. "His name is Daniel, and I chose it for a reason." The air in the room felt electric, heavy, suffocating, the stunned silence pressing into every corner as the realization crashed over her like a tidal wave. Because Daniel wasn't just any name. Daniel was the name of the son she lost. The child she had turned her back on. The child she had ruined. The child she had destroyed. The story had been whispered in fragments over the years, a carefully guarded secret that no one dared to speak of in full, a name that had been erased from every family gathering, from every photo album, from every memory that Linda had tried to rewrite. But I had learned the truth. I had pieced it together from half-finished confessions, from the stray conversations she hadn't meant for me to hear, from the long, painful silence that filled the room whenever his name was almost spoken. Daniel had been her failure. The child she had smothered, controlled, broken down until he had nothing left. And in the end, when he had finally escaped her grasp, when he had finally cut her out of his life completely, when he had chosen to disappear rather than endure her manipulation for another second, she had erased him, wiped him from existence, pretended he had never been born at all. And now, she was staring at me, her eyes red and wild, her hands clawing at her own chest as if she could physically pull the pain out of herself, as if she could undo the years of damage, as if she could rewrite the past one more time. But she couldn't. Because now it was real. Now everyone knew. And now there was no escaping it. Linda let out a strangled sob, a sound so broken that, for a brief second, I almost felt sorry for her. But then I remembered every lie she had told, every cruel word she had spoken, every single moment she had tried to strip me of my own motherhood. And so, as she stood there, collapsing beneath the weight of her own sins, I leaned in one last time, my voice barely above a whisper, but carrying every ounce of finality that she deserved. "Now tell me, Linda," I murmured, watching as her breath hitched violently in her throat. "Who's the real parent here?"